You cannot block President Trump from issuing his executive orders that call for mass layoffs of federal workers. Now, let's talk about this recent ruling that I think was really a big issue and a big deal that sort of got pushed under the radar with some of the other news that happened just a few days ago. The deal with this new ruling by the Supreme Court, it's major, especially if you work for the federal government, but even if you don't work for the federal government, it's pretty important. Here's what happened. Back on July 8th, just a few days ago, the U.S. Supreme Court lifted an injunction. Now, this injunction that was out there had basically blocked any mass federal layoffs that were tied to President Trump's February executive order that was aimed at major workforce reductions. And this injunction had blocked those mass firings across more than 20 or more different federal agencies. Now, basically, just a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court said, you know what? You cannot block President Trump from issuing his executive orders that call for mass layoffs of federal workers. You can't block that. The Supreme Court basically ruled that the president's administration was likely to succeed legally in its authority to issue these mass layoffs. Now, on the Supreme Court, the lone dissenter of this decision was Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She basically said in her write-up that this effectively allows unsanctioned dismantling of the federal workforce, right? That's what she said in her write-up, which she said was a potential erosion of the federal checks and balances that have been in place for hundreds of years, obviously, right? But here's what's next for federal agencies. Now that this injunction has been removed and now these agencies have an executive order directive to actually lower their workforce or decrease their workforce, here's what's next. Federal agencies are now in the process of getting ready to mobilize to put in these large federal layoffs, and we thought that they were over, but they're not over, right? It got caught up in the courts, but now the court said you can move forward. So now you have agencies out there who are actually getting things in place and getting things mobilized and ready to rock and roll to start implementing these mass layoffs, right? Through the White House Counsel and through OPM. And keeping in mind, they're also looking at due process, unions, and all the battles that are going on in the courts as we speak. So they're looking at all these to get these agencies to get these things in place to start these federal mass layoffs again. And now, hey, there's about 2.3 or 2.4 million civilian employees who work for the federal government here in America. That's a lot of people that could be affected here. Now, according to some reports, specifically the Atlanta Federal Reserve, they put out a report that said there's been 275,000 layoff recorded events so far this year amongst federal government employees. That includes confirmed firings, people who have been fired, people who have went for the buyouts that were offered a few months ago, and just simply planned reductions that have already taken place. And that is basically about 10 to 12% of the federal workforce so far this year has been affected by these layoffs that have happened already. And now we're about to increase that again with the upcoming mass layoffs that have just been sanctioned or approved by the Supreme Court. Now, full disclosure, guys, I work for the federal government, been working for the federal government for 23 years. So part of what I'm telling you on this video about the fact that you need to be aware of this stuff is from what I'm seeing and what I know. Right behind closed doors, there's a lot of people who are nervous and on eggshells about their federal government job, right? You've had a lot of people who have left, who really didn't plan on leaving the federal government in terms of working for the federal government, who have left in the last 6 months or so, who were planning on being there 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 more years, who said, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm gone, right? There's a lot of people that say, hey, look, I just want to walk away from this chaos right now and this uncertainty every single day of not knowing whether I'm going to be working the next day at my job or not, right? So a lot of widespread in the federal, amongst federal government workers, a lot of widespread stress, anxiety, and uncertainty, with many people hoping and counting on union protection, right? At one time, you work for the federal government, you had this job security. Well, that's no longer. And, when you lose like really, really experienced people from a job who people have been there 10, 15, 20, 30 years, it can hurt, right? It can make things now run a little bit less efficient when you lose some of those people with all that expertise. It can hurt efficiency, it can hurt production, it can hurt morale, and it can definitely hurt the level of work that you're doing, the quality of the work that's taking place. And I also read a story that said if the federal government loses, maybe up to 1 million people or so in terms of employees, it could have a effect on regional labor markets. For example, if you're in St. Louis and the federal government lays off 100,000 people from the St. Louis, different agencies in St. Louis, it could have a major effect on that region's labor market, especially when you're talking about small markets, right? Losing 1 million people in Atlanta might be different than losing 1 million people in St. Louis. Could have a much bigger and broader effect in some of these smaller markets, smaller cities, because you have a lot of private sector jobs that are tied to the federal workforce. So if you don't have these workers, these federal workers working, maybe you don't have people who are selling hot dogs out of their food trucks at lunch, or you don't have people that are working in the shops that are near these federal hubs in these smaller cities. So it can have a trickle down or a ripple effect on the private sector workforce in those areas when you lose these federal jobs.